Chapter 1. Verses 1-7. Since Paul had not been to Rome, he begins his letter with his credentials. He calls himself a servant of Jesus Christ. In the original Greek text, this word is doulos, which means a bondservant or slave, someone with no personal rights. Interestingly, in the Greek, Paul's title for the Lord is kurios, which describes someone as having total undisputed power of possession over person or thing. It is the opposite of doulos or slave. Paul, in the most severe sense, thought of himself as the slave of Jesus Christ, his master and Lord. Since Jesus had loved Paul enough to die for him, Paul was confident that he no longer belonged to himself, but to Christ. The word doulos was also used to describe the great men of God in the Old Testament. Moses referred to himself as a doulos, or slave of God. It was the proudest title given to the prophets because it set them apart from other men. Therefore, being a slave or bondservant of Jesus Christ describes both the obligation of a great love and the honor of a great office. Next, Paul describes himself as an apostle called to a specific task. In John 15:16, Jesus said, "Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that ye should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain." Paul did not think of his life in terms of what he wanted to do, but rather what God meant for him to do. In Galatians 1:15, he identifies with the fact that God separated him for the task of apostleship even before he was born. Knowing this about Paul, we can understand his awareness, verse 5, of having received two things. One, grace as described in the introduction. Paul had tried to maintain the law through the Mosaic doctrine, but found that this did not bring righteousness. He realized that the only way we could achieve righteousness was through God's grace, a gift that we could not earn nor buy. 2. His task. Paul was set apart to be an apostle unto the Gentiles. He knew he was not chosen for a special honor but a special responsibility. We are all set apart unto a task. Christianity separates us from the world, not for self-glory or pride, but in service and humility and love for all, proclaiming the gospel. Verses 8-15. As we said earlier, Paul had a great love for this church that he had never seen. Since he had nothing to do with their founding, he had to win them over to take away any suspicions of interference or intervening where he did not belong. So Paul prays for the Christians on the firing line at Rome. These people, who would later become human torches in the Caesar's gardens, food for the lions and sport for the gladiators, were already suffering hostility. Maybe the people were concerned that he really didn't care. Paul puts himself in their shoes and assures them of his love, his prayers. He thanks God for their faith that was known throughout the world. That was the style of the Apostle Paul. He was brilliant, strong, heroic, the church's most gifted theologian, but his most obvious characteristic was a pastoral heart. When placed within a powerful position within the early church and exalted as apostle unto the Gentiles, he kept his gifts in perspective and realized that his gifts were not for his own benefit, but for the entire church. With humility, he told them that he longed to come to them, not only that he might minister to them, but that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. Verses 16-17. Moving past Paul's introduction, we immediately encounter what is almost universally regarded by New Testament scholars as the theme verse of the epistle, Romans 1:17. In this verse, Paul quoted from the prophecy of Habakkuk. "See, he is puffed up, his desires are not upright, but the righteous will live by his faith." Habakkuk 2:4. Here we find the concept that absorbed the apostle's mind throughout his letter. Here Paul sets forth the concept of justification by faith. The righteousness of God is a righteousness granted to us, not according to our obedience or our merit, but a righteousness given as a gift we receive by faith. God alone gives us the righteousness that enables us to withstand his judgment. Paul presents the wonderful news of salvation with us. Historians tell us there was never a greater time when people were seeking salvation. They had heard for 500 years of Greek philosophy and saw that it did not work. The Christian faith came at a time when a dying world could be offered salvation that would keep a person safe in eternity. Second, Paul outlines the concept of faith. This is a concept very real to Paul as he outlines it in the various letters he wrote. Faith means a total acceptance and absolute trust to the will of God. It means believing what Jesus said is true and staking all time and eternity on that assurance. Paul then goes on to outline the concept of justification. The original Greek translation is from the word dikaion and defines the concept this way. If we justify ourselves, we try to show reasons to prove why we are right. In other words, justifying ourselves. However, when God justifies a sinner, he does not have to look for reasons to accept us. What justification means is that God treats the sinner as though they were not sinners at all. God looks upon us as children needing to be loved. This is the heart of the gospel message. Therefore, to be justified is to enter into a new relationship with God, a relationship of love and confidence instead of distance and fear. We no longer have to approach God as someone radiating punishment, but rather, a God who showers upon us forgiving and redeeming love. To Paul, and to us, it is the total work of Jesus that allowed us to enter this relationship with God. Verse 18. Following his wonderful declaration of justification by faith alone, Paul abruptly changes his focus to explain why justification is needed in the first place. God plainly reveals himself in all creation, but people choose to stifle that truth. They knowingly exchange truth for a lie and move from a proper knowledge of God into idolatry. People worship things, philosophies, ideals, all rather than God. In Ezekiel 18, for the prophet says, "The soul that sins shall die." What we are faced with is the fact that there is a penalty to be paid for sin. There is a moral order of right and wrong, and anyone who violates it will suffer. This was the total message of the Hebrew prophets. God made the world in such a way that we break his laws at the risk of facing his wrath. If we were left to this fact, there would be nothing but death and destruction awaiting us. Into this wrath comes the love of God out of his free grace that brings us out of the consequence of our sin and saves us from the wrath we should incur. Nevertheless, for those who suppress the truth of God, and continue to do so, is being stored up for that person. Verse 19-20. Every human being in this world knows, and knows clearly, there is a God. Therefore no one can plead ignorance as to the knowledge of God. It is not as if God hid difficult clues in nooks and crannies of the universe, so that only astute theologians or intellectual geniuses who pursue truth would ever be able to uncover them. God has clearly manifested himself to humankind, and through his creation has displayed his existence and power. The truth content cannot be challenged. Verse 20 tells us that no human being, regardless of race, personality, class, environment, or religion, will be able to stand before God and claim, "I never knew you existed." There are no acceptable excuses on that judgment day. Verses 21-23, to think in the final analysis that all of our efforts are judged to be worthless or of no value is a sad commentary on humanity. Yet Paul says that because humanity refuses to honor and bow to God in gratitude, all human thought, no matter how brilliant, ends in futility. Paul sees the failure to acknowledge God's existence, not so much as a problem of the intellect, but rather as a moral problem, the problem of the will. People who refuse to honor God's existence do so, in the final analysis, because it is contrary to their manner of living. They do not want to bow to the claims of a holy God in their lives. Thoughts and actions would have to change. Repentance for sin and the pursuit of righteousness would need to be evident. Imagine this: a man buys a costly block of wood, brings it back to his workshop, and then uses all his artistic skills to carve that block of wood into the likeness of an animal or a person. He sands, polishes, and varnishes it, and when he is done, he cleans his tools. He then takes his carving to a religious leader for consecration, returns home, sets the statue in a prominent place, spreads a mat, and kneels before it in prayer. There he implores the very wood he carved with his own hands to help him through difficulties and bring him safely into the afterlife. Can you imagine anything more irrational than for a man to worship the product of his own hands? That's what idolatry is. It substitutes the corrupt things of this world for the majesty of God. The glory of God is traded in for the glory of a snake, or a crocodile, or a block of wood. This is how irreverently humankind has treated God's glory. God alone deserves worship, and his word says he will not share his glory with another. Verses 24-27, God's punishment is perfectly matched to the sin. In other words, there is a kind of identity between the particular type of sin and the particular type of punishment. The sin referred to in these verses is that of dishonoring God. The resulting punishment is that men and women are given over to their own evil desires. It is not as if God visits evil upon them out of nowhere. Instead, he gives them over to their own lusts and to their desires and inclinations to dishonor him. God allows their evil to go unchecked to its natural outcome. The effect is dreadful. Those who are given over by God to their sinful nature will find that their bodies are dishonored and degraded among themselves. In our age, there is a crisis of human dignity, a crisis of honoring one another. But when the honor of God is ignored, it must happen that humankind will slide headlong into dishonor. Since human beings are created in the image of God, there is a very real sense in which, as God goes, so goes the image bearer. Verses 28-32. It is almost impossible to grasp the full strength of what the apostle is saying here. It is not simply that people are unwilling to know anything about God. Rather, Paul teaches that they prefer not to maintain or seek after full knowledge of God. The people Paul is describing here did not see any worthwhile purpose or value in pursuing the knowledge of God in any kind of depth, nor did they even see the value of maintaining the knowledge they already had. How is it possible for a person to be a Christian and not have a passion for the knowledge of God? The human problem stems from corruption and fallenness. A person converted to Christ is certainly changed and transformed by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, but just as Adam and Eve hid from God, we have a natural aversion to the pursuit of the knowledge of God. This passage clearly shows what happens to a person when they do not learn to seek after God. Notice that this is not so much the judgment that God sends, but rather the judgment we bring on ourselves. When we put God out of our lives, we become certain kinds of people, and Paul gives us the terrible description of the kind of person we become. Let's look at some of the descriptions of the words Paul uses. Evil, Greek, adikia. This means an evil person is a person who robs both man and God of their rights. They worship themselves to the exclusion of God. Wickedness, Greek, poneria. This means not only doing harm, but desiring to do harm. Satan is described by this word as one who deliberately attacks and aims to destroy the goodness of people. Covetousness, Greek, pleonexia. This is described as the spirit in a person that will pursue its own interests with a complete disregard for the rights of others. Maliciousness, Greek, kakia. This describes the person who is lacking anything that would try to make them good. It is the complete badness in a person out of which all sins and evil grow. Envy, Greek, phthonос. This is defined as a warped and twisted emotion where a person looks upon the possession of another and rather than wishing them well, resents them. Murder, Greek, phonos. Jesus expanded our use of this word by describing it not only as a deed, but also as the spirit of anger or hatred. Debate, Greek, eris. This describes the inner struggle born from envy, ambition, and desire for prestige. Deceit, Greek, doulos. This describes the quality within a person that has a twisted mind, who cannot act in a straightforward manner and would rather act in devious and underhanded methods to get their own way. Malignity, Greek, kakotheia. This describes evil-natured people. It is a spirit that always looks at the worst in people. Whisperers and backbiters, Greek, sithuarists and katalalos. This describes people with slanderous tongues. One is very open with their slander, the other is very quiet about it. Haters of God, Greek, theastuges. This describes the person who hates God. God is the only barrier between them and the fulfillment of their pleasures. Despiteful, Greek, hubristes. This describes the spirit of a person who is so proud that they defy God. This is a person who performs deeds solely for the purpose of hurting others. They get a warped pleasure from it. Proud, Greek, huperphanos. It is used 3 times in the Bible when describing how God resists the proud. James 4:6, I Peter 5:5, and Proverbs 3:34. The whole life of this person is surrounded with an atmosphere of contempt, and they gain pleasure by making others feel small. Boasters, Greek, alazonia. This describes the spirit of a person who walks around pretending to have what they do not have. They are out to impress others, while everything they say is usually developed in their own mind. Inventors of evil. This phrase describes the person who is not willing to be satisfied with the normal ways of sin, but develops and seeks thrills in new forms of performing sin. Disobedient to their parents. This issue was discussed by God in the 10 Commandments. The reason for including this here is that once the bonds of the family are loosened, moral decay must follow. Without understanding, Greek, asinitos. This describes a fool, someone who cannot learn the lesson of experience. Without natural affections, Greek, astorgos. At this time in history, the family was decaying. The life of a child was subject to the momentary feelings of the father. Implacable, human life was cheap. Slaves and children were destroyed. People found delight in seeing men kill each other. There was no mercy nor quality of life. Paul has given us a picture of what happens when men and women deliberately banish God. In due time, Rome died. Tragically, our course today seems to be on an eerie parallel.